Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The AIDS epidemics hitting Africa is of massive proportion, and that affects large chunks of the population. 2/3 of all infections all over the world do occur in Africa. In some countries, between 10 to 20% of the populations is infected by HIV, in particularly in the age group between 15 and 49 years of age. And this is an unparalleled situation all over the world. During a recent trip to Africa, the Pope stated that condoms are not the best mean to prevent the infection from spreading, and that this statement brought about brutal reactions both from the general press and also from the scientific literature. And some people said that the Pope was a murderer and that he should apologize to the entire world. And there was a meeting in Milan, and Mr. Ciantia took part in that meeting, and we discussed about this problem, and the human position expressed by the Pope was the most reasonable and the most sort of interesting and effective in terms of prevention of HIV spreading. And then another consequence that we sort of noticed is that AIDS prevention is not just a medical problem, but it is also a cultural problem, because it has to do with the personal life of a person and the perception the person has about their own destiny. So that is why we decided to have this meeting during the Rimini meeting, because we thought it was important to have a special session to discuss about this position, to explain it and justify it. That's why we invited Dr. Edward Green, who is the director of the AIDS Prevention Research Project of the Harvard School for Public Health. And also we invited Dr. Filippo, doctor in charge for the Great Lakes region in Uganda, and Rosie Busingye in charge of the Kampala meeting point. And so, these three reputed speakers will tell us more about the facts, will give us figures, and will tell us more about a number of situations and realities. And most of all, they will tell us why the Pope expressed this position and why this position is the most sort of rightful one, also from a human point of view. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Edward Green, and so I'm asking him what's the current situation now in terms of HIV infection in Africa.
Buongiorno, signori e signore. Now I have to speak in English. Okay. On his flight to Cameroon last March, the Pope said, if there is no human dimension, if Africans do not help by responsible behavior, the problem cannot be overcome by the distribution of prophylactics. On the contrary, it can increase it. Next slide. I don't know where my slides are. Okay. The next one. And the next one, world reaction. World reaction was swift. Next slide. World reaction. The press said this is outrageous, wildly inaccurate. The Pope deserves no credence. The Pope inhabits an alternative universe. Impeach the Pope. The Pope is living in a situation of total autism. The Pope his comments are alienating and ignorant. Next slide. So my opinion was sought. A magazine called the National Review called me to ask my opinion, also Christianity Today. And then after those first two dozens, scores of magazines, radio stations, television, They were all asking my opinion. I was not always quoted accurately, and so I decided I can control the message if I have my own article in the Washington Post and also in the medical journal, the Lancet. Next slide. I was struck by how close the Pope's comments were to what the latest and the best research has shown, which is that responsible behavior, especially mutual monogamy, not having multiple partners instead of condoms, are the answer. And for once in such a debate, we didn't hear the word abstinence. The next slide. The next slide. There's actually no evidence at all that condoms have worked as a public health intervention intended to reduce HIV infections at the level of population in the so-called hyper-epidemics of Africa. Something might work for individuals, but it doesn't work as an intervention for populations. Why is that? Next. So why condoms don't work in Africa? People use them inconsistently. Also, there was low demand for condoms for many well-known reasons. They reduce pleasure. They imply a lack of trust within a couple. And then there is something called risk compensation. And the next slide, I define it. Yeah. This is when somebody uses a technology such as condoms or sunblock to reduce the risk. But then they compensate for that, or they erase the risk by taking greater risk. So having more exposure to the sun or taking greater sexual risks in the case of condoms. All of these issues are chronic, they're unchangeable, they're universal. It's no good to say, well, then the problem is getting people to use condoms all of the time. We've tried that, and it hasn't worked. Next slide. Now, most HIV infections in the world are sexually transmitted. Yes, there are some epidemics that are driven by injecting drug users, but most epidemics are sexually transmitted, whether they're heterosexual or homosexual. And having multiple and concurrent sex partners is what drives these epidemics. Next slide. And yet, until very recently, there was little or no effort made to discourage people from having multiple sex partners. Uganda was an exception. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, next slide. Now, why was there no attempt to change people's sexual behavior? Well, AIDS prevention strategies were developed in the United States with universal vulnerable groups in mind. The groups that were becoming infected, men who have sex with men, injecting drug users, and later, and in other countries, prostitutes or commercial sex workers. So prevention resources went to what we call risk reduction, or to medical technological solutions with American epidemics in mind. Soon this became the model for every country. So we, who controlled the growing AIDS industry, we forced this approach on all countries, regardless of the culture, regardless of the epidemic. And so for prevention of sexually transmitted HIV, the model emphasizes condom social marketing, voluntary counseling and testing, and treating the curable sexually transmitted diseases. And note that this formula, condoms, testing, drugs, they don't require changing sexual behavior, only adopting some medical device. The next one. There is little or no evidence that any of these prevention measures that are now found everywhere have contributed to the slowing of HIV in the type of epidemics we have in Africa. That includes promotion of condoms, voluntary counseling and testing, the mass treatment of sexually transmitted infections, vaginal microbicides, and synergistic interventions that combine different ones that I've just mentioned, and even the availability of antiretroviral drugs. None of these have been found to work in Africa. But the global AIDS industry has been very slow to acknowledge this. So basically, these interventions don't work if by not working we mean having an impact at the level of population. But the world has invested heavily in these technological solutions that don't involve fundamentally changing sexual behavior. I will mention that some of these interventions work in some other countries. For example, Thailand and Cambodia, where most HIV is found among prostitutes. It is possible to promote condoms to prostitutes and their clients, and that can have an impact, but not in Africa. Next slide. Okay, what does work is having fewer sex partners, or faithfulness, fidelity, and male circumcision. In all African countries with generalized epidemics, we have seen HIV prevalence go down. Where we've seen HIV go down, it's always preceded by men and women reporting fewer sexual partners in the previous year. For ethical reasons, we have not done randomized controlled trials to measure the impact of partner reduction or fidelity, but we've done this for male circumcision. And in the 3 African trials, they were all shut down early because the effects of circumcision were so clear, a 60% or more reduction in HIV. HIV has been gradually declining in Africa for about a decade. I don't have time to show you the data from the different countries, but in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Zambia, Malawi, Cote d'Ivoire, these all came after Uganda. But in every case, before the HIV declined, men and women were reporting fewer sexual partners, or there was more faithfulness. Next slide. How did it come about that we developed an approach to fighting AIDS that didn't require changing sexual behavior, that was limited to condoms, testing, drugs? Next slide. I'll sketch a little background between 1982 and 1985. In America, as I said, MSM, men who have sex with men, and drug users, there was a need to reach these high-risk groups. And so issues about stigma, discrimination, illegality, and access to services arose. And imagine if you're a gay man and all of your friends are dying of AIDS and your government is not even talking about AIDS, you can see how people became activists. But there was an agreement not to interfere with people's sexual behavior, not to judge their behavior, not to make moral judgments. This would just drive away the homosexuals and the drug addicts. That was the argument. Next slide. There was a gay science journalist named Gabriel Rotello, an Italian name. He wrote that gay men felt that they had suffered and struggled for many years to achieve sexual freedom, that they enjoyed by the 1980s in America, and they weren't going to give up this freedom easily. And so AIDS prevention education placed emphasis on condoms, implying or saying there's no need to change your sexual behavior. Next slide. But there was evidence that there was decline among HIV incidents and of behavior change among gay men. But what was that and why? Was it because people were dying off, with people with the highest risk? Was it behavior change? Was it condoms? The position of the gay activist groups was it was condoms. Whoever it was gay men became the experts in AIDS prevention. So agencies in my country, USAID, Centers for Disease Control, NIH, they looked to these new experts for guidance and direction. And by the way, almost nobody besides gay men were interested in AIDS in the early years. So the U.S. began to gear up. Next slide. The U.S. began to gear up for global AIDS. From our first response were projects called AIDSCOM and AIDS Tech. And we had to ask, who was interested in working in global AIDS? Well, it was gay men, and it was those who worked in international family planning, like myself. I was working in family planning. Next slide. So the approach we call risk reduction, it was attractive because it seemed to work in San Francisco and New York. It was popular with high-risk groups in America who are now working in Africa and everywhere else. It allowed for the continuation of sexual liberation. Health professionals tend to like medical rather than behavioral approaches and solutions. Next slide. Also, the technology was familiar to family planning experts like myself. Condoms seemed logical. Condoms were easy to count. We had ready units for monitoring and evaluation. And it was comforting to think that we had a cheap, simple technology like oral rehydration salts to prevent AIDS. So AIDS prevention became a commodities distribution challenge, just like family planning. Next. Okay. It was also popular because it supported an ideology of sexual liberation. And sexual liberation is a natural ally to other political causes like human rights, gender equality, poverty eradication. It attracts liberals like myself. Soon a multi-billion-dollar industry developed around risk reduction. Anything that questioned the basic assumptions were seen as a threat to this big industry. And professional reputations were at stake. People didn't want to admit that they might be wrong about something involving millions of lives and billions of dollars. Now I need to skip ahead 2 slides to challenge to the dominant AIDS prevention. No, one more. Proxima. Next one, Proxima. Okay. Uganda demonstrated an approach to AIDS based on behavior change rather than technology. The approach made people feel personally vulnerable to getting AIDS. But they could take certain simple, common sense steps to not become infected by not having more than one sex partner and by delaying the age of first sex. Next slide. Now, biologically, how can we avoid the sexual transmission of HIV? There's 3 things we can do. We can avoid the exposure, we can reduce the exposure, or we can block the efficiency of exposure. This is the famous ABC approach in Uganda. A, abstinence or being faithful. B, being faithful. And for C, blocking the efficiency, that would be circumcision, using condoms, lowering the viral load. Next slide. The early slogans in Uganda were "Love faithfully." That actually was that came from the church. That was a slogan that came from the church. Love faithfully. Another one was "Zero Grays." It means keep sex at home. If you're in a polygamous marriage, be faithful to your multiple wives and stick to one partner. Incidentally, Uganda didn't use the term ABC in the early years. It came later. but that's what they were doing. The next slide. The president of Uganda said, just as we were offered the magic bullet in the 1940s, we're now being offered the condom for safe sex. We were being told that only a thin piece of rubber stands between us and the death of our continent. I feel that condoms have a role to play as a means of protection, especially in couples where one is HIV positive. But they cannot become the main means of stemming the spread of AIDS. In the next slide, this is one of the early pamphlets from the late 1980s. Condoms are not even mentioned until page 43. And what they say here is that even if you're using condoms, you can get AIDS. This is very unusual. You will not see a pamphlet like this supported by a major donor anywhere else. I need to skip ahead. Let's get... Go ahead, 3 minutes. Okay. Let me skip ahead to this slide called Uganda Model. Not this one, the next one. Yeah, go back. Okay, HIV prevalence fell from 15% to 5% over 12 years. They used an indigenous, homegrown African approach to AIDS, at least in the early years. I don't have time to tell you about the recent trends, but in the early years they had this very effective program, and this program cost 23 cents per person per year. Next slide. So let me summarize what was different about Uganda. No, go back one. Go back one. They approached AIDS. No, you go back. Go back one more. Okay. They approached AIDS as a behavioral instead of a medical problem. They tried to influence sexual behavior at a deeper level. They aimed at avoiding the risk, not just reducing the risk. They didn't start with the premise we cannot or should not change sexual behavior. They used an A-B approach with real A and B interventions. And it's not the same as abstinence only. And they also used something called fear appeals, making people afraid of getting AIDS. Okay, next slide. So you can see in the early years they used posters that were very fear-invoking, but they did it in a way that did not stigmatize people who were HIV positive. Next slide. Next. This shows a long-distance truck driver. If this poster came from another country, you'd see the writing, "Don't leave home without your condoms." But here it says, "I'm going straight home to my wife." The next one. Next. Proxima. This is another one just showing a man. He says, "I'm saying no to AIDS. I'm sticking with my family." This is probably not the kind of usual AIDS poster you're used to seeing. And there's one more like this. Next one, Proxima. This is the same. This comes from the Ministry of Education, but it's the same thing. Simple drawings of people being faithful to their spouse. Next one. Next. This shows a middle-aged man trying to entice a schoolgirl with money, and her friends are pulling her away. This is a problem in poor countries. You know, older men with money try to seduce young girls. Next slide. Now, this is a very different slide. This comes from Botswana. This shows a girl. She's 14 years old, and she has a middle-aged lover. And she's saying, that she adds spice to her life by having a middle-aged lover, but don't worry, she uses a condom every time. You will not be surprised to hear that the religious groups and the government, the school teachers, everybody was so angry with this poster that they had to pull it away. And the final slide. That's the title of the book that I wrote in 2003, challenging the dominant paradigm and saying, listen, we have a simple, effective model that was developed in Africa by Africans, and it works. Meanwhile, our expensive technology-based approach doesn't work. HIV is going up right now in my country, in America. We should be going to Uganda and learning from them. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie Ted. Abbiamo visto che non è una posizione, è una
So we have seen that a human position is effective and not technology, and this defies the current mindset. Say you have been working for 30 years in Africa and you dealt with these topics for so many years. Do you want to tell us our experience? Sorry for turning my back to you, but still I didn't see you because the spotlights are right in our eyes. So this is my presentation. Well, we're running out of time, so I'll try to follow the slides, and so I do apologize for showing my back to you. So thank you very much for asking me to talk about this topic, because I can say that, wisdom has to come to terms with unexpected things, because as Edward Green said, Uganda is a real exception in the framework that he explains so brilliantly. So next, my remarks are the confessions of a sort of standard health worker, because I've lived in Uganda for a long time, as long as the AIDS epidemics has been developing and being rife. So here you see the list of the topics I'd like to raise. And as Ted said before, when this new disease was found, and I've been to Uganda many times with my wife, and for 5 years we have lived there without knowing that disease. And when in the mid-80s we found out about this disease that was transmissible through blood conducts, our fear was enormous. In the beginning, people died with no sort of hope of any kind of survival. So the fear, the stigma was great. And so what Ted tried to explain was the extraordinary response given by Uganda. And the message conveyed to the people was very clear, with no blurry or dodgy messages, and the posters were so clear. So it's a fatal disease, it's a lethal disease that can destroy our country. That was the message. But this message at the same time said, we can fight against this disease, against its spreading, so we can prevent this disease from spreading. So we are in 1987, and that campaign was based on behavioral change and sexual habits change. So that was the only way to stop the epidemics. So that was the only way, because there were no drugs available or no other ways. So at that time, that showed that the leading cause of AIDS was at the very heart of men. So the people and the entire society had in itself the response, so could do something. And in line with the speech delivered by Museveni in 1991 in Florence. He said that Uganda wanted to go back to basics. Uganda wanted to go back to relations based on a genuine interest for another person, and especially young people needed to be trained towards abstinence, towards a sort of health and sound culture that didn't look for pleasure just for the sake of it. And so that generated an incredibly positive response, as Ted said, and that was the result. So a reduction from 20% to 5-6% in a few years, because that message worked. So let's see the milestones of this success story, of this great success of Uganda. Well, first of all, the people were put at the very heart of these campaigns. So there was a lot about personal responsibility, personal accountability, and so everybody was mobilized, everybody was involved. And so that was the success of the people from Uganda, and not from Uganda as a country, but Uganda as a country made of individuals, made of people. And again, among the milestones, we see, first of all, the people. And we have Rose here today from the meeting point, and we have other people from Uganda in the public, in the audience. Then we have Tazo, and the real people were the real response, the real solution. So on top left, you see Norin Kaleba, the founder, one of the most important organizations fighting against AIDS in Uganda, probably one of the most important in the world. It's a support organization known as TASO, and she's a physiotherapist, and I think that many of us know her. And today she still works. And we have Miriam Dagenung, an Irish nun, and she had a great intuition. The response to AIDS was not in hospital, so she left the hospital she directed to work in the community. And the Cambodian Christian community was set up thanks to her. So it's a community that takes care of the disease, of the sick people, that takes care of young people, of families. And Rose knows this person very well. She knew her at the beginning of her career. Then we have the Corti couple. We have a Canadian surgeon who was sort of infected by AIDS during a surgery intervention. And so here, these are the protagonists, these are the main players. And again, you see here some archive pictures. To your left, you see Erionge and his wife. They set up another meeting point. And when he found out to have the disease, he wrote a wonderful book, and please do read it if you want. And he also set up a support group trying to help the people who needed to be heard, who needed to have some help to sort of being protected from stigma. To the right, Filippo, famous African singer and songwriter, and at one point he decided to do his outing, and he told the entire world to have AIDS, to suffer from AIDS, and that touched many people, and he devoted the rest of his life to the fight against AIDS and to the fight against AIDS spreading. And he wrote a wonderful song called Alone, and he says in this song that the most dreadful thing about having this disease is that of feeling alone. But he says in the song later on that you are not alone anymore because there's something next to you, beside you, helping you. So here you see two people that are quite different. You see the wife of the President Museveni, And Janet is extremely committed when it comes to young people education, and Rose knows her, and we have involved her in a couple of events. And our generation is a generation that is illiterate from a spiritual point of view, because our real tragedy is that the hearts of many men and women are sort of sick. So this is the real problem. And then to the right you see Como Rose, and in Kumu she was my secretary, and when I came across Enyunge, and after discovering to have the disease, she understood that she could devote the rest of her life to supporting other people suffering from the same disease. And so I remember that one day I asked her if she could just drop by my office and put a sort of notice on the notice board, trying to sort of see if there were people who wanted to talk about their experience, if there were people who wanted to share their experience. So I tried to involve her in order to do something to help other people. And she died after a long fight, and she used the very first drug. There was no antiretroviral therapy, there was just the AZT, and she died over 6 months. And until the very last moment, until the very last breath, she always tried to do something for the others. And after her we had Rose and Vicky, people we know, people who have come to the meeting many times. And please do buy the video called Greater Defeating AIDS. Next, please. And I define AIDS as the greatest tsunami in public health, because this is a tsunami that generates so many tides, and it generates in the long run many orphans, because families are destroyed, adults die, and so we have all these children left alone. And the biggest tsunami was that of solidarity, of empathy, of sympathy. Today we are faced with a new challenge, the challenge of treatment. In Uganda, we have 1 million HIV positive people, and 350,000, 400,000 need to get the drugs. And so we do really need to tackle these additional tide, this additional tsunami. And next, please. What is most important, so the fil rouge, linking up all the faces that I showed you a minute ago, because behind every face there is a story, there is something, but all those people are connected by something. So the fact that all those people try to sort of share their experiences with other people going through the same fate, the same destiny. And we all know that nobody of us is strong enough to tackle such a great tragedy. We all need friends, we all need support. So this is the sort of the link, getting all those people together. And I just want to add a remark. And as you have seen, Tad went through a lot of sort of inner conflicts, and unfortunately his program will be finished this year because it's an inconvenient program. And so the Uganda case is an inconvenient case because there's a lot of controversial issues, and so there are many economic and political elements at stake, but there is also a great deal of cultural elements, because there's a lot about the conception of men and how men is seen. And I took part in the AIDS International Conference in Bangkok. Ted, do you remember the debate in Bangkok? ABC versus CNN. So we discussed about the ABC versus the CNN. And we compared those two approaches. And so in 2004, there was a full front attack against Uganda. So a theoretical model was opposed to the Uganda model, so condom needles and negotiations. Then in Toronto, the same happened. At that time we had Bill Gates and Bill Clinton, the two Bills. And they were present, but many others were absent. And Bill Gates talked about his foundation, and Bill Clinton talked about results, investments, but the orphans were not there. Africa was not very much mentioned, and sort of young people from a local children's hospital were not there. So everything was focused again on other topics. And then Mexico City, another conference in 2008, we were shocked, gobsmacked, because again, many issues were dealt with, but probably not the most interesting, because so much was said about homophobia and the problems of transvestites, but many other fundamental issues were forgotten. Therapies for children. Still today, we do not have special drugs for children suffering from AIDS. And then nothing was said about microbiocides and the negative impact of the excessive financing on AIDS that may have negative repercussions on health systems. And then going back to the Pope, John Paul II and then Benedict were targeted by the Lancet as well as by many other scientific publications. And the Lancet devoted 2 editorials to Pope Benedict, and also the previous Pope was addressed articles from the scientific community. And so after the trip to Cameroon, as Ted said, some people started talking about the redemption of the Pope, and the Pope was in a way impeached. And so there were many brutal and swift reactions. But according to my personal and professional experience, I'd like to share with you 3 possible conclusions about the lessons I learned. And I have prepared these 3 issues, these 3 bullets from a personal point of view. So the first proposal is about development. Development generates health not when the development tries to impose upon the public technological solutions. But development is good when it's driven by a people and not by an elite. So it is important that the people are the protagonists of this development. So that's why I wanted to show you those faces, because those faces are faces of real people. Secondly, we need to base our judgments and remarks on facts. So we need to have a matter-of-fact approach. So it's not about opinions or wishes, it's about facts and figures. So what Ted said, what I'm saying is that the Uganda case gives us, in evidence-based medicine era, something that is a real lesson the world should learn. So I hope that Europe will start learning something from Africa. And evidences are important, so let's try to consider them. And then third, that approach put into place in Uganda was an approach extremely individual oriented. So a lot, the emphasis was on the personal responsibility of people. So the effectiveness of the approach is strictly related to the enhancement of single individuals. And I'd like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to talk about this topic and to talk about Uganda. And specifically, I want to publicly thank Ted Green, who is one of my masters. And he sort of taught me so many interesting things, so many fundamental things that, just changed my life. So it was a great chance for me to getting to know him. He was my mentor. Thank you very much. And secondly, I'd like to thank all my colleagues, my fellow colleagues. I recently come back after 29 years in Uganda with my wife. We have come back to Italy, so now I'm doing something different. So I left Uganda, but I want to thank all my colleagues, especially my wife, who took good care of me during these years. And I want to thank the sick people I got to know, and they were, they are, and it will also be a great lesson for me. So when I look into your eyes, I'm happy. Thank you.
Grazie Pippo. Tu ci hai detto che l'educazione è la grande risorsa.
Thank you. You said that education is the human being's main resource, and the most difficult thing is being alone in the disease. Rose, you said that the human being is worthier than the disease. Good morning, or good afternoon actually. When I read the title, AIDS is Culture, I thought that culture is not disseminated via AIDS. Culture is disseminated if you know what a human being is made of, what a human being is made of, what I am made of. In order to know that the person is at the center, we need to know where we are placed and what we desire, what we wish for, what I'm made of, and what the others are made of. To understand a human being, I need to understand myself, not a dog, or not anything else. I need to know what I'm made of. Then I will realize that the others are just like me. It is a new concept of life, a new approach to the family, the home, the disease, and everything else, a new way to approach oneself and the others. I'm not a detail. I'm not marked by a detail like having been infected by HIV. Scientific or existential inquiry is not enough. Our days are marked by confusion, as is the current world. Nothing emerges, no face emerges, no awareness emerges. This confusion starts because the individual is treated as a detail or as one single aspect, for instance, sex or disease, thinking that if we change the sexual, for instance, the morning after pill or the use of condom or abortion are no solution at all. What do I do? What do we do when faced with the problem of genocides or bullets? Do I have to wear a condom on my head to be protected from that? We need to start from the entirety of human beings. Human being is marked by generosity. I visited the prison of Padua. That seemed to be a prison with maximum security measures. And then I entered the prison and I met a group of men who, in spite of their past crimes, cannot be defined as on the result of this. I met two men who were convicted to 190 years, and one of them said, "For me, Jesus is what is important. I'm not constrained by these bars, the prison bars." I realized that he wasn't lying to me. And when I meet the women at the meeting point, I realize that they're not defined on the basis of their disease. They simply say that they're sorry that they received the virus, or indeed they're not sorry because they really discovered who they are. They realize that life does have a value, and once you realize that your life has a value, you start protecting it because you really love it. If you say that the condom has a 0.0000% to convey the virus, then I cannot risk and I cannot endanger my own life. Well, our women in Africa, well, if an HIV patient, a woman, well, women are not considered on the same footing as men. Nevertheless, women can react. If a woman says, "I'm going to play football," well, in the past that would have been unacceptable. Today, this is acceptable. If a man is told by his wife, "I'm going to play football," then the husband will probably follow her and cheer. We played a football match with the University of Washington, and these women were playing football, and yet people were astonished because they didn't look like desperate people at all, being infected by the virus does not mean that you have to be unhappy. If compared to poverty or disease, a human being risks being denigrated and being defined as a result of such conditions. But the world exists, and everything we do is something that defines the world, even though we are just individuals. The problem of HIV and AIDS is a problem of life which leads to the discovery of the full dignity of love and human life. If we are sincere, if we start from the human being, then we need to wonder what the meaning of life, sex, love and death is. Nobody can say that they're not concerned. All this contributes to a discovery of the human condition and to finding the energy to face reality in the right way. Without such awareness, it is not possible to help anyone, nor ourselves. Nor can we help the others. Instead of helping the others and ourselves, we will keep complaining and blaming the others, offering just compassion, and even though we react, we respond, we deceive once again, because the current vision of the world leads to dismembering the human being in multiple fragments. Therefore, the current world produces an image and a way to depict the human being as an aggregation of fragments, each of which is subject or submitted to its specific rules. Specific rules for affection, others for leisure, love, for the relationship between husbands and wives. But all this leads to confusion and contradiction, in which the human being is boiled down to something that can be maneuvered. As Dante said that this is like the ruins of a house after an earthquake. Each piece, in this case, each fragment, is fighting against the others. Therefore, a human being is fragmented. You have to follow specific rules to be able to sleep, and so on and so forth. Because, and I'm now addressing especially healthcare workers, well, we need to know that accuracy and technique are not sufficient. A human being is not like a table with a broken leg which can be replaced. If you have a sore eye, you treat the eye. But we do not realize that we are treating a human being. A human being is the result of many different aspects and factors. If you touch somebody's hair, the person turns. It's a living person. The whole person reacts. It is a phenomenon of nature. Touching one point implies the entirety of the human being. And this even more true as far as human beings are concerned. And Earth knows, and an ear, nose, and throat doctor does not simply treat the nose or the throat or the ear, but it treats the person who has a nose. You're not just treating a piece of that person. This is also true for animals, but even more true for human beings. If we base our action just on duty, well, we realize that this is not enough. Listening to the previous speakers, I thought we have to be cautious, not just in the case of AIDS, but also against everything that endangers the human being's dignity. We need to foster the stability of the human being. If we pay attention to this, we realize that a human life is a search for the meaning of life. Women who treat or care other women and patronize them, do not patronize them. Do not say, "I'm sorry for you, you're going to die." They simply say that to the other women who are infected, that they have to find the meaning of life, the value of life. Then they can really protect their own lives. But this value cannot be discovered unless we discover in ourselves what the value is. Boys and girls, after meeting Caron, realized that HIV is not related to sex, but rather related to the need to know who or what we are living for. The men from Naguru are not infected. Nevertheless, they came to our meeting point and said, "Your women, even though they have HIV, are happier. And so we want to stay here too, even though we are not HIV patients." And indeed, these men are still there. They don't want to have anything. They want to stay there. They play the drum, they dance, and they play football with women. Because they have found, and this is a result of the fact that these women have found a reason for living, a wider meaning that goes beyond the detail. If we see the meaning of our life, we feel as if a light was brightening everything, and we start discovering the real truth of our lives. And then we start cherishing our own lives and also the lives of the others. Similarly, when faced by disease, death, or sufferings, the human being needs to find a meaning to that. And happiness is not a result of being an HIV patient, but rather from renouncing the quest for the meaning of one's life. If a human being does not grasp the meaning of things, the profound meaning, well, many people ask me, why do we have to live? Why do we have to have children? this is so difficult and demanding. Why do we have to get married? Young people want to have fun, but having one single partner is boring, and then they start complaining. If we lose sight of our own value, then we lose sight of the value and the meaning of all the other things, and then we start treating ourselves as things or tools. If we do not discover our own value, we cannot be responsible for ourselves, nor can we build up culture, and we cannot even see the value of the others. Therefore, we cannot treat or cure them. Oh, scientific research cannot change our customs and behavioral patterns. What is needed is a reason to change our lives. And I'm finishing. It's not out of fear of being infected by HIV. Fear is not a natural feeling. Father Giusti said that the first feeling of the human being is attraction, and then fear arises when one perceives the danger of losing that attractiveness. The first and most important thing is our attachment to life. In Uganda, they had written slogans to scare people, stating that you have to stick to one partner, talking about the zero grazing, and then another slogan said, if you really can't have one sexual partner, then you can use a condom. We cannot disseminate fear. Finding someone attractive leads to research, to the search of our own life. Loving and being loved is something wonderful, but this love should be forever, and not a way to be satisfied or to quench one's instincts. I cannot exploit human beings. Don Giusti used to say, Father Giusti said that nothing is sweeter than being loved by somebody else. The problem is that we do not even love our own lives. We simply stick to our opinions and instincts. When we were holding a conference with the president's wife, Janet, men said, if we don't use a condom, we're going to die. And then the president's wife said, stop behaving like animals who cannot abstain. Cats and dogs cannot abstain. But if we consider ourselves to be human beings, then we realize that the people we love have a value. In the current civilization, is not evolving because it does not emphasize the individual's value. These values are currently and constantly challenged. Therefore, a commitment, for instance, to relationship is rejected. What the Pope proposes is a new attitude to life, a new awareness also in the relationship with the spouse or the lover. Nevertheless, we know that the Pope is a very conscious and aware person, somebody who's aware of the meaning of things, a person who can generate a new mentality and culture. I do agree with the Pope. I think that the problem of Africa is not just the problem of AIDS. And in order to understand that, we need a man of faith. Faith is something that should pervade humanity. Something that should go down to the basic perception of things. This is a result of a life in faith. The passion for life means respecting other people. If you start from this attitude, you can change the current culture and build a new one. But our reaction needs to change. The main object of my work is a relationship with a friend, which leads to a change of our lives.
Grazie Rose.
Thank you very much, Rose. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, people. I just want to say that in order to train professionals, we have a Medicina Persona, a very important association, and you will find the latest issue of the Journal of Medicine theirs, and many of the issues that we raised today are further developed. Thank you very much.